Good afternoon. Well, welcome back for this next session. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Pisser of Columbia. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And I hear you taught classes yesterday at Columbia. Well, thank you for coming to talk to us after such a long trip.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a great pleasure to be back here in Sao Paulo and at the FGV. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to congratulate you to this wonderful program that you have to put together. And we're now celebrating its 10th anniversary, if I understand correctly. So it's a great pleasure to share some of my ideas about law and development as they have evolved over the years with you. I teach law and development at Columbia. I've done this for quite some time, both in seminar form and then as a 3-credit course. I'm offering also it to students in their first year because it's an opportunity to introduce them both to important development issues but also to aspects of comparative law, including the legal development in developing countries or emerging markets. I should disclose that I myself working on a book project, and I will use some of the ideas of this book project and will explain them to you in a little while. And I think they shape the way I think about law and development right now. So my outline for the talk is to say I want to talk about law and development. I call it inside out. I want to move a little bit away from the traditional notion of thinking about each country almost like a patient that gets some treatment and see whether it works, right? That's sort of a, let's say, a World Bank style approach to law and development. So we have sort of these insulated cases of country by country, and some are a little better and others are not. And then we think about how to maybe contextualize legal reforms so they are not, so immune or resistance against them. And I just want to say, well, maybe we should also think about law and development from the perspective of developing countries and put this into a broader geopolitical context, economic, political, but also, as I will argue, the way law travels, especially in a system of global capitalism, has to be taken into consideration as well to understand really the predicaments of countries that are more on the periphery of a global capitalist system. So I'm basically going to say that what we really have to talk about is not just law and development, but what we're really talking about is law in the context of capitalist development, which is the dominant form of economic organization in most countries around the world. And one probably also has to concede that it's the kind of economic system that has brought most prosperities to societies, but also always a great deal of inequality. So we have to think about the root causes of that, but I think we should just name the thing what it is. It's really about capitalist development, which I wouldn't say there are no alternatives. Clearly a particular form of the socialist system has crashed, but I'm not saying that there's only one form of capitalism. So we'll come back to this, to these notions a little later. One thing that I want to stress already at the outset, and we'll talk about more, is we do have a global capitalist system. And although I will argue that actually capital, the thing that makes capitalism, is coded in law and actually in national law, the puzzle that we have to resolve then is how can we have a global capitalist system without a state and without global law, without a global state and without global law. And of course that brings us then to really unpacking the system, thinking about the political economy. And last but not least, I want to ask the famous question that Lenin posed exactly 100 years ago, right? We're celebrating the centenary of the Russian Revolution these days, and что делать? So what is to be done is the big question. Okay. So what do I mean by law and development inside out? So the standard phrase that most of you have seen, and of course you can easily unpack, and I don't want to spend time on that, but the idea is sort of you basically put good institutions into place, and if you then do something else to ensure that there's enforcement, so there's voluntary compliance, but there's also enough enforcement, then you should get the right economic outcome. And as I said before, this really perceives of the problem of law and development, and as sort of like, we have these patients out there and we just have to give them the right treatment and deal with the problem of the fact that many of them seem to be immune to the treatment that we've given them. I've written about transplant effects. David Trubek has written a lot about why law and development doesn't always work. And I think, we just have to move on a little bit beyond these debates, as I think both of us have advocated for many, many years. So I just want to throw out a hypothetical and say, let's just assume the treatment really works. Let's assume all countries would accept the institutions that are the best practices, best institutions. Would this really, really mean that we would have prosperity for all? And then you, of course, have to ask the question also, well, what about inside those countries that have these great institutions, the good institutions? Does everybody share the same levels of prosperities or opportunities? And obviously the answer is no, right? So something else is missing here in the debate when we only are focusing on whether or not institutions stick when we transplant them or give advice, etc., right? So we have to put the law and development problem into a broader global context. So this is now the segue I want to make it to saying that it's really all about economic development in a capitalist type of system. And so economic development at the rates that we've seen it and prosperity have been associated with that system. And then that raises the question, what is capital? We can have, of course, a long, long debate about that. There are different definitions in the literature, and you can also look at sort of the usage and practice in the 15th or 16th century. Brodel has written about that, how people just talked about capital as being wealth, but something that has been accumulated in the past and is now preserved. Marx, of course, made his whole theory about extracting value from labor belongs in the category of sort of creating new type of capital, but through a particular process of production. Thomas Piketty, of course, has joined the debate with his famous book on capital in the 21st century, and he defines capital as wealth. He basically says all non-human assets that can be exchanged on some markets, and thereby you can flip whatever value they have into monetary wealth. And I think this is more of a concept of accretion, but maybe also expectation to gain future wealth from the assets that you have. Again, exchanges, Piketty I would put into this context, and then John Commons, one of the old institutionalists in the United States, writing in the 1920s on capitalism, basically makes a very forceful argument that property, but also all the other legal forms are all about expectations, and shows how courts increasingly have sanctioned expectations, and you can get compensation for expectations, and that the real depth of these legal concepts is to protect the expectations, or protect some expectations as having priority over competing expectations, and that's what we have to be looking into. Why capital is so important to understand, I think, is in part because of this empirical regularity that Piketty has shown us now, is that on average, capital within developed market economies has a greater rate of return than the rate of economic growth of these economies. And that, of course, is the reason why we have inequality. If those who have capital can accumulate or grow their wealth, incubate their wealth better than others, then you will have necessarily a disparate levels of wealth if the rest of the economy grows on average slower. So we do have to unpack this thing. Now, I don't want to sort of go into all the details of my book, but I just wanted to throw out here two just different voices, one of which I do use a lot in the book, and I will say a word about this in a second. So how to think about law and institutions and capitalism. So Danny Roderick recently wrote a paper where he again sort of made his point that maybe the state is under threat, but also made the point that both we have the certain logics of economic systems that can be encapsulated, however, in different type of institutional forms. And I just picked out this quote of this article where he says, "Institutional diversity among nations is as close as we can expect to a real-life laboratory for capitalism." So he quotes Roberto Anga and basically says there's a whole diverse set of institutions, and you can configure capitalism all kinds of different ways. So it's basically let 1,000 flowers bloom, although functionally I think he would say that you still need to think about property right in a certain way, or maybe corporations in a certain way, but there could be all kinds of different variations. So that's a positive I think, yeah, sort of normatively speaking, a positive view of great institutional pluralism and the possibility for great institutional pluralism within the system of capitalism, which of course cuts against the grain of this best practice view. But here's another quote that I find actually more intriguing by the late Bernard Rudden. And he wrote this in a piece in 1994. I'm going to read this to you because I think it's really worth sort of pausing here. He says, the traditional concepts of the common law of property, he just focuses on that, but I think it's one of the core institutions that, of course, people who think about development latch onto. So the concept of the common law of property were created for and by the ruling classes at a time when the bulk of their capital was land. Nowadays, the great wealth lies in stocks, shares, bonds, and the like, and is not just movable, but mobile, crossing oceans at the touch of a keypad in the search for a fiscal utopia. In terms of legal theory and technique, however, there has been a profound, if little discussed, evolution by which the concepts originally devised for real property have been detached from their original object, only to survive and flourish as a means of handling abstract value. The feudal calculus lives and breathes, but its habitat is wealth, not land. So this is a very different way of looking at institutions, right? So you can see basically, you can look at a set of institutions. I would say it's property, but not only property, it's collateral law. It's the common law trust, corporate law. And I would throw maybe bankruptcy into the mix. So these institutions have a history that dates back hundreds of years. And yes, they were first used to code land as capital, or code or make land an asset that can be protected in value. And they were then grafted onto different types of assets. Pools of assets, corporation, trust for business entities, knowledge, patent, intellectual property rights, financial claims of any sort, right? And they all, when you look at the structure, when you look into the legal structure of the financial assets that are being traded, you see in every securitization structure in the common law world, you see a trust, you see hierarchy of claims that can be either done through collateral or use contractual devices to achieve the same thing. We're having safe harbors for derivatives and repos today where we had protections against bankruptcy for the landed elites in the past. So the same thing comes back, just in different disguise. I would submit it's a very different view of institutions in capitalism than what Danny Roderick projects, and I think it's probably the more accurate one. So what I do in my book is basically I'm trying to tell the story about how the same institutions were grafted onto different assets over time. So the title of the book that I'm writing is called The Code of Capital, and the code, of course, you have to think of not a codification in the traditional legal sense, but more like the DNA, right? So if you think about a DNA, I'm basically going to say, very flippantly, but I don't think it's entirely inaccurate, to say, give me any object, any claim, any idea, and I flip it into a capital asset that is a wealth-producing asset if I give it the right legal DNA. And the legal DNA is basically giving these assets, here are the 4 elements that you need to have, or the 4 attributes that you have to have: priority, superior rights vis-a-vis other types of claims, that must be universally enforceable, right? That's sort of the classic definition of property rights in the civil law world, these absolute property rights, meaning that they will be enforced against others who were not at the bargaining table. It's not a contract, it has third-party effect, and that works only because it's the state backs them. Durability is important, and that's somewhat counterintuitive because we think it's all about competition in markets, but for wealth to accumulate over time, you need to protect it. There must be some insulation, some durability created, which we create through trusts, for example. We just leave assets behind a trust veil, and that means you exclude certain types of creditors from access to these assets. It's the asset shielding that Henry Hansman and others have written about. We see this also in the corporate law, and we see it in bankruptcy safe harbors. Certain assets are not under the same bankruptcy rules that apply to everybody else, and thereby have sort of basically get an extra bonus, an extra protection. And then last but not least, especially when we move from land to other types of assets, the ability to convert the assets into something else and ultimately into money becomes increasingly important. So can I transform my rights and thereby monetize them, right? So that's sort of a critical feature as well. And we can see here the development from contracts that were not assignable to bills of exchange that you can freely hand on, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Okay, so basically what I'm arguing here is that over the past few centuries, a relatively small set of institutions has been used to code different types of assets into capital, and what they do is basically they graph these different types of attributes or these four attributes I just mentioned on different types of assets. It doesn't have to be trust, corporate law, property, collateral, name it something else, but if it's functionally doing that work, giving you priority over others, over competing claims, protecting you from a group of creditors, only a subgroup is better than being exposed to any creditor, right? So if they do that, if they have these shielding effects, I think they belong into this group, but I would say in the Western legal systems, common law, for sure, and also in French or in German civil law systems, we see similar equivalent institutions. We don't have a trust. I think the trust is actually the most ingenious device ever imagined for coding capital. So that's a real drawback on the civil law countries. And if we want to go back to the debates about whether civil law or common law countries are better for economic growth and development, I say, well, something is to be found in the ability to use basically private contracting mechanisms to create property effects that don't even have to be registered in this purely private form, right? It's the ability to code capital, not the protection of property rights. It's the ability to create your own property rights protection that gives the common law the head start here. And of course, that has huge implications for the political economy as well. So I already mentioned that you can just give me any assets and I'll code this for you. So what is the effect? What do these elements really do? Of course, these by grafting priority, universality, durability, and convertibility on assets, you give them a comparative advantage over competing assets in times of distress. In particular, I always like to say that bankruptcy is the asset test where you can see who really has what, right? It's in bankruptcy, by definition, there are no longer enough assets to give everybody what they want and what they had contracted for ex ante, but we have clear priority rights who will be satisfied first, right? So if there is somebody who is an owner of an asset that happens to be in the possession of the debtor, then he can or she can take it out. If you have a secured claim, you can take it out of the pool and you can enforce against that asset. If you're an unsecured creditor, you just get a huge haircut because you're sharing the rest, right? The leftovers, basically. And how to set priority rules creates sort of new types of how to basically create this hierarchy in bankruptcy creates new types of property rights. So I would argue, for example, that the bankruptcy safe harbors that we're using for derivatives and repos, where we're saying if you're a counterparty to a derivative or repo transaction, you are not bound by the ordinary rules of bankruptcy. You don't have to wait, for example, but you can net out your counterclaims and just walk away. That's a way of giving a privilege to a particular group that is almost akin to a property right, because de facto, you're an unsecured creditor, but we're giving you a status by allowing you to net out your claims and walk away that is much more akin to a property right. So that's the first thing here, basically saying it's a comparative advantage, especially in times of distress. The second one is legal coding. That's sort of important to think about prosperity. So we use legal coding to create the expectations that you actually have a comparative advantage, that you have greater, not only legal certainty, you also have greater expectations that you will get actual returns. And yet, the legal coding alone can never be a guarantee for actual economic performance. I think that's sort of the separation of sort of basically two minds, the schizophrenia of this legal coding is you create the expectations that you have something that's better than everybody else. But there might be a real possibility that there's a full default and nobody will get anything. And that's, of course, when the system crashes. This divergence between the expectations for legal certainty and the actual performance of the underlying assets, I think, also lay behind many crises, including the recent financial crisis. So this was point 2 and 3. The outcome of sort of this, the coding is that we have both prosperity for those who have capital or have, better said, maybe have access to the masters of the code, of capital, who are the lawyers, transactional lawyers. In England in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, these were the county solicitors who would do the land conveyances, right? They would draft all these deeds, and so you could still do something with the land, but you were protected. So the landed elite in England basically, even after feudal property rights were abolished, they tried to protect family land from creditors by basically putting them under the rules of strict family settlement, under entails, so that even secured creditors until 1881 could never get more than 50% of the land, and never the family mansion, right? So the current owner of the family wealth was only the life tenant, and he had not the right to give away the entire family wealth. So these legal structures were basically used to protect family wealth. They look very much like a trust, and we use nowadays trust to very similar ends to protect them from competing creditors. Okay, so this is why we have, you get prosperity if you can code these assets, and of course those who don't have access to coding and to the assets that are such coded as such, they don't have the same levels of equality. And then since it's all coded in law, and code law has a very strong path dependence, and it's backed by the state and has the authority, you're basically entrenching inequality in that way. So where is capital coded, right? And obviously there's legislature and there are court cases, etc. But as I said before, I think the true masters of the code are the transactional lawyers, and increasingly so in our global world, because they can increasingly pick and choose from a menu of state laws that are on offer to code capital. You just have to, you just use Cayman Islands for tax purpose, of course, but you can choose between London and New York depending on the type of derivative that you want to issue, and if you like English law better than, let's say, German law, then you just shift your transactions to English law and you do it right there. And of course, the more malleable the legal code is, the more it gives private autonomy and the ability for private transactional lawyers to craft these assets, the greater the power of the code. So they're using existing legal institutions, but they're also finagling with them because they're malleable. You can basically try to push the boundaries to throw other types of assets into the trust. If you just look through the history of securitization, you start with a very simple model in the early 1970s, and then all of a sudden you get these complex contracts where lawyers, tranche different claims in the pool such that people have different types of priority rights. That's creating a very different type of trust. They typically negotiate then with tax authorities and others that they still get the same treatment even if they do that. But so they change in the institutions, but in a basically bottom-up private fashion. I think that's really where most of the action takes place. It's in the private transactional law. The regulatory stuff comes as a response to that, typically a little late, and as some of the transactional lawyers with whom I teach and talk in the city of New York basically say, first of all, they can mute almost any regulation that comes in and tries to bind their hands just by using the same toolkit and finding another way around. And the second thing is the image that I like very much is to think of regulations, so regulatory law like financial regulations and prudential stuff and entry barriers for different intermediaries, etc. This is like the scaffolding, and as a transactional lawyer, you're trying to put together assets or new entities that just fit through the gaps of the scaffolding. And the legal techniques that you use for that is analogy, gap filling, creative interpretation of existing legal devices. And I think at the exposed stage, increasingly trying to ensure that disputes will be resolved through private settlements, at most private arbitration, but not in a state court, because the state court could basically undermine the work that has been done in this particular fashion. Okay, so, and then these abilities to finagle the assets in this way, of course, are enhanced by our tendency in the global arena to have soft and hard harmonization of law, sort of to make it possible, basically, for those who are mobile and can code capital around the globe to have at least similar conditions, maybe not optimal coding conditions everywhere, but certainly you won't have to fear that some of the coding strategies that you have devised under one law will be struck down elsewhere. We of course have also an entire world of global law in which we work with standardized contracts, the master agreement that organizations such as the International Swaps and Derivatives Associations have come up, where they're basically creating an entire world of contractual devised law that sustains global derivatives markets, swaps markets, etc. We have also sort of supported this with conflict of law rules that ensure that what you do in one jurisdiction will be recognized in another. There's been a lot of attempt also to harmonize conflict of law rules, so they of course are domestic law, but if you harmonize them or create a treaty, for example, that creates a new standard for having determining the rules that shall be applicable to assets that essentially don't have a location, such as most financial assets don't have a location, right? So what is the attachment? What is the sort of the nexus to finding the right conflict of law rules? If you standardize this globally, you create much greater legal certainty for how you can do this. And then, as I mentioned before, the private dispute resolution is important, but it can be so important because we have such a thing like the New York Convention on the recognition and enforcement of foreign and international arbitral awards. So you piggyback free right, basically, on a set of treaty devices that make it possible to use private arbitration as a globally enforceable set of dispute resolution rules. Okay, and that, of course, brings me to the next big topic here in my talk, where I basically said, okay, I'm arguing essentially that capital is coded in law. The elements that I mentioned, property, collateral, trust, corporate bankruptcy law, are elements of private law, and they are domestic, right, by nature. So the puzzle then has to be how come we have a global capitalist, financial capitalist systems, and yet we don't have a global law. And I'm basically saying that you could sustain global capitalism through a single system of domestic law, as long as all other states recognize and enforce the kinds of priority rights that you have created in that system. And the reality that we face, I think, is that we have not one but two systems that code most of the financial assets that are traded globally. It's the laws of England and of the state of New York, right? So this is true also for sovereign debt. So most of the emerging markets, so the volume of U.S. debt outstanding, the U.S. does it count? It does it not count? Clearly, but most emerging markets who enter in and try to access sovereign debt markets, or many of them use English or New York law. Most of the derivatives that are traded globally are coded under English or New York law. These master agreements that I mentioned before, the ISTA Master Agreement tells its members that they should either choose English or New York law and English or New York courts, and warns them to do anything else, because then the certainty of these agreements cannot be guaranteed. So you have a global capitalist system, but you don't need global law for that, because you have basically conflict of law rules and the harmonization of law that I mentioned before that helps sustain the system. And in fact, we have two systems that do this. We also have, on top of that, if you just look at the denomination of these assets, you get a similar, maybe slightly more diverse picture. We have most of the financial assets are denominated in, for those that we have data on. But if you just take BIS, Bank of International Settlement Statistics, is the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound that are most commonly used to denominate financial assets that are, including private assets, of course, that are traded globally. Okay, so then the big political economy question, of course, is whose code is it, right? Who should decide what types of assets? If you say any claim, any object, any idea, I could decide whether or not it's worthy to have priority rights that are universally enforceable, that should have the benefit of some durability, right? And might be convertible either as a matter of right or as a matter of might in times of crisis. When do I actually accept whatever asset and give cash in return is the big question that central banks have to ask themselves, sort of who shall determine that, right? That's the normative and, of course, the political economy question. And clearly, leaving the coding largely in the hands of private coders has given us the vibrancy of capitalism. There's a competitive coding world out there, staffed and populated, of course, by lawyers, but pushed by the clients. And I think without that, we wouldn't have sort of these innovative institutions that we have today, for better or for worse. But we have a lot of the vibrancy, maybe also the pluralism that Danny Roderick views in the capitalist world has to do with the ability of private actors to code capital. The role of legislators and regulators and courts, in principle, you could say we could leave it to the private coders if we can then have at the, let's say, the public level, the legislators, the regulators, the courts, some pushback in terms of saying, well, you can do that, but you cannot do this, right? And here we want to maybe do some redistribution because we think this is getting a little bit out of hand. But the question is, do we actually have the institutional capacity and the political capacity to do this kind of pushback? I would say that the ability of nation states to use basically their institutions that are democratically governed, like the legislatures, indirectly the regulators and the courts, to push back have been diminished in our world of regulatory competition. So once you can pick and choose the laws that best suit your client's needs, then you can just avoid any pushback that you can get from certain countries. And so the countries are on the back foot and having to coordinate, right? So the coordination abilities of nation states are, of course, tested, and as we are seeing right now, is that that's sort of not a great strength of many countries, especially if put under stress. So we have a lack of coordination among states, and I think especially as people become increasingly anxious about the inability to control a system, for whether or not they understand the reasons for that, but I think the less able governments become to coordinate with other governments, because there's this, as we see, this nationalist backlash around. I think that also, especially in developing countries and emerging markets, the ability to push back is further diminished, in part because they don't have the institutional capacity or the political power, but also in part because they're facing a broader opposition that includes not only domestic players, but also global players against any attempt to do so. And then last but not least, of course, we have seen this a lot also in the law and development debates, is that many emerging markets, developing countries have been pushed to outsource the law to private parties or to other legal systems, embrace, let's say, the law of Delaware, or embrace the law of England or so for sovereign debt, to bind their hands so that they would actually play by the best practice rule and lose control over doing their own thing. But that, of course, the flip side of that means also is that they have no longer control to check what is happening on that front. Okay, so I'm going to come to an end very soon. I just want to push the theme of the political economy of law and development just a step further, really, into the global financial system as we have it today. So Hyman Minsky famously said, actually, capitalism is a financial system, right? It's basically making bets on future returns in an uncertain world. You typically, credit plays a hugely important role in that system. Perry Merling, who is basically a student of Minsky's, has further developed some of his basic insights, has argued that finance, or the money system as he calls it, is inherently hierarchical. I think I would agree with him, but I would also say it's not, how hierarchical it is and exactly what shape it takes is dependent on the institutional structures, including the legal institutions that I've been talking about. So when we take a look at the global world of global capitalism, we see a handful, or maybe really only two core countries at the apex of the global financial system that is hierarchical, sponsoring the law that is used for globally traded financial assets that can also have the capacity of destabilizing financial systems elsewhere as well. The countries on the periphery offer basically the prospect for expansion in good times, but they're also the first place from where capital retracts in bad times to protect as basically the core. And this process of expansion and retraction is at least in part beyond the control of local players. So typically what we think about is that, if countries just sort of sustain their good institutional development, they would be able to sort of to deal with the external shocks as they come along. And what I'm basically saying is the system is configured such that clearly the greatest stress is in the part of the world that is peripheral to the core, because the core is going to protect itself. Yes. Okay. So studialat, I want to come back to Lenin's question. So I don't have easy answers here. I'm still wrestling with the final chapter of the book, where I guess I have to say something about what do we do about all that. I think the first, of course, is always you have to recognize the problem. So maybe it's not so much about good or bad institutions, but it's the really question is who controls the code and what implications does the coding of capital in a certain way and under certain types of law have on people within those systems, but also external to them. The political economy of law and development is not only a question of the domestic setting of these countries on the periphery, but of the global setting. And then I think in slight disagreement again with Danny Roderick, whom I like a lot in many ways, but I think it's not really the state that is under siege, because the state is actually needed to protect capital, right? The state is protecting these legal attributes of capital, at least a state, and the other states actually have to be playing along by recognizing and enforcing them. What is really under siege is our ability to self-govern, right? And these are two different things, and I think we have to take them apart to make progress in our analysis and maybe then our responses as well. So the governing the code, especially when we think about our global system, obviously faces important political dilemmas, because as much as we would want, and I don't want to have, to sort of talk about protectionism or nationalism as the solution to it all. I don't think that's helpful, but I think clearly we have to realize that our polities are organized at the national level still, to some extent at the supranational level, but see what's happening in the EU right now or in EU member states such as Spain and others. So having polities organized at the supranational level is still a stretch, right? But that's the only level where we have, where the polities are, is where we can actually think about pushback and can make the kind of normative decisions that I think we should be making about who should get what kind of priority rights, what assets should be recognized as having these additional attributes that give them longevity and therefore are wealth producing. So, and the political organization, of course, is again, typically weaker in periphery countries, in part because of history, but also in part of being at the periphery, right, and being exposed to the kind of stress that you face when you have to deal with all these external shocks or exogenous shocks that are part of a system that you can't fully control from the inside. And of course, we're seeing increasingly that the advocates of global capital are much better organized, and we see them in the Institute for International Finance in Washington, in the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. This is really the who's and who's of both finance and law. They're very well networked with regulators in most of the core countries, and make important advances in other countries as well. And then last but not least, as what we also can see is that actually the opposition to this process of creating certain privileges and backing them in law, they tend to be increasingly anti-global and inward-looking as well. And so, if we want to think about an open system, which I would, for normative reasons, I would prefer rather than having sort of a very nationalist protectionist type of, well, but if we want to think about an open system that still gives us some space to think normatively about these issues and make different decisions than have been made in the past, what we need is actually political advocates as well who embrace that rather than also turn inwards and become extremely local and anti-global, anti-cosmopolitan. So I think I'll leave it at here.